Can we know idealism to be true from the basic facts of reality? Or is idealism not a good theory to explain the world? In this video, I hope to argue that idealism is consistent with empirical observations and can explain our reality far better than physicalism, dualism, or bottom-up panpsychism. We shall first lay out the basic facts of reality. 1. There are tight correlations between a person's reported experiences and the observed brain activity of the person. 2. We all seem to share or inhabit the same universe. Number 3 is that the laws of nature normally work independent of personal volition, so it seems that reality exists beyond our personal boundaries. And 4. Macroscopic physical entities can be broken down into microscopic constituted segments such as subatomic particles. These 4 facts are explained under physicalism in the following way. If the brain doesn't produce experience, then why is there tight correlations between reported experiences and brain activity? How can we all share the same dream if dreams are always private? And finally, if the world is in consciousness, then why does it act independent of our volition? At first glance, it seems that physicalism has the upper hand in explaining these facts better than idealism, but these are not the only facts that need to be explained. For one, the first fact has a big unpacking to do. From fact 1, in fact, we get 5 other facts. Number 5 is that regardless of what is the true ontology of a person, there is undeniably that which experiences, or TWE. This fact is not saying that experiences is something immaterial or supernatural, rather simply that experiences necessarily entails a subjective field, even if this field is material. In our previous video, we went over why experience and consciousness are undeniable aspects of reality, so we will not go over why here. Fact number 6 is that a person's private experiences can only be known by others if the person reports them, since others do not have direct access to others' private experiences. Fact number 7 is that the brain activity of a person is known only insofar as its observation is experienced in the form of perceptions. Fact 7 simply stems from the fact that we can use fMRI scans to measure the experiences of a person. And finally, fact 8 is that from facts 1 to 7 there is tight correlations between someone's inner life and the brain activity of that person. Someone's inner life is the intrinsic appearance of consciousness, while the brain activity is the extrinsic appearance of consciousness. In other words, the extrinsic appearance is how inner life is perceived by another entity. The brain is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. However, both the intrinsic and extrinsic views are both experiences insofar as they can be known. Finally, fact number 9 is that the brain has the same essential nature, or belongs to the same ontological class, as the rest of the universe. Given these facts, we may now ask the question of which metaphysical view of the world best explains them. Is it idealism, dualism, physicalism, or panpsychism? I will argue that idealism is the most parsimonious. What I mean by parsimonious is that which theory requires the smallest number of postulates while maintaining sufficient explanatory power to account for all the facts. From the 9 facts before, we can draw, in fact, 6 inferences from these facts. Inference 1 is that the most parsimonious and least problematic ontological underpinning for fact 5 is that which experiences and experience are the same nature. Experience is a pattern or excitation of that which experiences, so anything that experiences would have the same ontology as every other experience. From fact 8, we know that the activity of the brain is accompanied by inner experience, since there is something it is like to be a living brain. Now, one may argue that our brains produce experience, but as we have argued in our last video, it is impossible to reduce experience in and of itself to something not an experience in and of itself. This is seen in what's termed the hard problem of consciousness. Basically, since matter cannot have experience in and of itself, then to explain consciousness you would need reductionism. But the problem is that reductionism requires that at the fundamental, bottom level of our brains, there is no thing that it is like to be our brains. So then, if our brains do in fact produce this experience in this sort of reductionistic way that physicalism requires, then our experiences in and of itself reduce to something that is not an experience in and of itself. Or in other words, if experience is not fundamental to the brain, but rather the brain produces experience, then it necessarily leads to what's an experience being itself non-experiential, and thus you're left with a contradiction. This contradiction, of course, is why the mind cannot have the properties of matter. Anything that we talk about, anything that we experience, again, constitutes consciousness, and so to try to reduce experience in and of itself to something that's not experienced in and of itself will create this contradiction. From this, we get to the next inference, which is that which experiences is an ontological primitive. It is irreducible. Now, given the inferences and facts so far, since experiences cannot be reduced to physical arrangements, and since brains do experience, and since brains are made of the same stuff as the rest of the universe, then we must face the possibility that the entire universe also has experience. The physical universe may, in fact, be akin to a nervous system in the sense that the universe is the extrinsic appearance of universal consciousness, in the same way that our brains are the extrinsic appearance of our inner life. From this inference, we get the third inference, which is simply that which experiences is associated with the entire universe. These inferences do not imply that there are parts of the universe that have separate conscious inner life of their own. That requires an extra inference, but inference 3 does not conclude that there is something it is like to be a chair, or a rock, or a tree, rather that the universe as a whole is conscious. Just as there is something it is like to be your brain as a whole, the same applies to the universe. Like, for example, there is nothing it is like to be an individual neuron. It is only the brain as a whole where we get the experience of what it is like to be our brains. So inference 3 would imply that all activity in the physical universe is accompanied by a conscious inner life at some level. We know the laws of nature apply to the universe, so it's more likely that the universe is unified in the conscious experience. Furthermore, entanglement would also imply that the cosmos is all connected in an irreducible whole. Given the fact of entanglement, there is no reason to think that the universe is not unified whole, and therefore the universe would be the extrinsic appearance of universal entangled consciousness. Now, the question remains as to why do we have separate mental lives? After all, if the universe is unitary, then why do we have private mental lives? Well, there is a way to reconcile these ideas, and this idea is called disassociation. Basically, disassociation entails that mental contents cannot evoke other mental contents. Bernardo Kastrup, for example, argues that we are disassociated alters of universal consciousness, given the evidence in psychology for people with dissociative identity disorder. So inference 4 is that there is a sense in which living organisms are unitary alters of that which experiences. This doesn't imply fragments of universal consciousness, rather there is only cognitive barriers between these alters. Basically, these alters of universal consciousness are like dream characters. A universal consciousness is the dreamer. So then we are still contingent on universal consciousness, and the universe is like the dream generated from universal consciousness. Now keep in mind, we are not saying that universal consciousness has this disorder, rather that the mechanism of disassociation allows it to create separate, conscious dream characters within itself. So, the mechanism by which universal consciousness created beings other than itself would be disassociation. We will explore this in more detail in a future video, but for now, we can lead to inference 5, which is that metabolizing organisms are the extrinsic appearance of alters of universal consciousness. The inference to this is simple. Since we have intrinsic aspects to ourselves, we are the only structures known to have disassociated streams of inner experiences. Moving forward, we must now ask about our perceptions. Are our perceptions irreducible, or do they reduce to universal consciousness? If one is a subjective idealist, they may infer that reality is totally subjective, and so our perceptions are irreducible. But this is not the case with objective idealism. Under objective idealism, perceptions carry extrinsic appearances and not thoughts. If you only experience thoughts, then you wouldn't have an extrinsic point of view at all. So perceptions are reduced to the thoughts of universal consciousness and not our own thoughts. Since everything is in universal consciousness, then everything from the perspective of universal consciousness would be intrinsic. Before the first alter was formed, universal consciousness only had thoughts. And so inference 6 is that the perceptions of an alter are reducible to the experiences of universal consciousness that impinge on the alter from the outside. Now that we have laid the groundwork, how does idealism compare to physicalism? Well, for starters, since we have shown that our perceptions can be reduced to experience, then physicalism requires an abstract and explanatory model to explain our perceptions of the world. Since our perceptions do in fact reduce to experiences, then idealism doesn't require anything outside of experiences. But physicalism postulates the existence of stuff outside and independent of experiences. Additionally, we know experience to be an undeniable ontological class, so experience is fundamental to the brain rather than produced by it. And finally, since the brain itself is made of the same stuff as the rest of the universe, then physicalism can be rejected on grounds of parsimony, because idealism can in fact explain our perceptions better. Furthermore, since physicalism cannot answer the hard problem of consciousness, then it can be rejected on grounds of explanatory power. Similar criticisms can be made for any ontology that posits a reality beyond consciousness. They all have to use non-consciousness as an explanatory abstraction when we know that idealism has the full explanatory power by not being subject to the hard problem consciousness or the combination problem. And idealism is parsimonious by using consciousness, the sole undeniable ontological class, to explain everything about reality without reference to anything beyond it. Given these inferences and facts, there is simply no reason to accept a reality beyond consciousness. So any ontology that is independent of experience is necessarily ad hoc, and therefore, idealism is superior to all other ontologies on the basis that it has the smallest number of postulates while maintaining sufficient explanatory power to account for all of the facts.